I wasn't invited to dinner because my mom missed me, and the ugly part is that I understood that before I even managed to get my coat all the way off. I had driven 40 minutes after work because she told me my sister and her husband went at me in the hallway with a kitchen towel in her hands, rubbing the same damp corner between her fingers while she kept glancing toward the dining room, where my dad, my sister, and my brother-in-law were already pretending not to Listenra coming over, and she wanted everyone at the table together for once, which sounded normal enough at the time, or at least normal enough that I did not question it. Before I could even ask whether I should leave my shoes by the door, she lowered her voice and said, "Just don't make this difficult tonight." That sentence stopped me harder than a raised voice would have, because it did not belong anywhere near a normal family dinner. It sounded like the middle of a conversation I had never been invited into, and the way she said it, quiet and already impatient, made it clear she expected me to understand my part without being told the rest of the story. "What am I making difficult?" I asked, still standing there with my coat half open. She smiled, but it was not the kind of smile people give when they are happy to see you. It was the tight, controlled smile she used whenever she wanted something unpleasant to pass quickly, as if the problem was not the thing being asked, but the fact that I might slow it down by asking normal questions. "It's just paperwork," she said. "We'll explain it after dinner, but please don't start with 100 questions before we even sit down." I remember looking past her into the dining room and seeing my sister adjust a glass that was already straight, while her husband looked down at his phone and tapped the screen without actually doing anything. My dad was sitting at the head of the table with his hands folded, not angry, not friendly, just ready, and that was the first time I felt like I had walked into something already arranged. The feeling did not come from nowhere. 4 months before that dinner, my sister had been dropping small comments about money in a way that made them sound like complaints rather than warnings. She would say the mortgage had gone up again, or that insurance was getting ridiculous, or that groceries felt like a second rent payment, and every time she said it my parents would rush to reassure her before anyone could ask a practical question. At first I took it as normal adult stress, because everyone complains about bills now and then, and I did not want to be the kind of brother who turned every conversation into a financial audit. Still, there had been little signs that stuck with me after the fact, like the weekend she asked if I knew anyone selling a cheap used car, because their second car was temporarily not worth fixing, or the time my mother casually asked whether my rent was still low and whether I had started saving for a place of my own. Back then, I thought my mother was just making conversation. Now, standing in the hallway while she watched my face like she was checking whether I might bolt, I realized she had probably been gathering information for longer than I wanted to admit. The second sign was the folder on the table. It was sitting right in the middle, where food should have been, a thick stack of papers with colored tabs sticking out of the side, and a black pen placed across the top with the kind of neatness that only happens when someone wants you to notice it. It was not pushed aside near a purse or left beside a chair like normal household clutter, but positioned between the plates like it was part of the meal. I sat down and asked, "What's that?" My mom came in from the kitchen carrying a bowl, set it down too carefully, and answered too fast. "Let's eat first." That should have been the moment I got up and left. But real life rarely gives you clean, dramatic decisions at the exact second you need them. I stayed because it was my family, because dinner had already started, and because part of me still believed there had to be a reasonable explanation hiding behind the awkwardness. For the next 10 minutes, everyone performed normal dinner conversation badly. My dad talked about traffic near the hardware store even though none of us cared. My sister laughed too quickly at a story that was not funny, and her husband drank water like his throat had turned to sand. Every time the table went quiet, my mother jumped in with something small and useless, keeping the room moving the way someone keeps music on when they do not want neighbors to hear an argument. The folder stayed there the whole time. Nobody moved it away from the food, nobody apologized for having documents on the table, and nobody acted like it was strange that a pen was waiting beside my plate. That was what made it worse. They were not hiding it. They were normalizing it, as if the simple fact that it sat there calmly meant I should accept whatever came next calmly too. After a while, my dad pushed his plate back a few inches and gave my mother a look so quick someone else might have missed it. I did not miss it, because by then I was watching everything. My mother wiped her hands, leaned forward, and touched the folder with 2 fingers. "Okay," she said. "We should go over this before it gets late." I did not reach for it. "What is it?" My sister looked at me for half a second and then looked away, and my mother opened the folder herself, turned it toward me, and said, "It's for your sister's refinance." That sentence still did not explain why I was involved, so I waited. "They're trying to lower the monthly payment," she continued. "The interest rate went up after the adjustment, and the bank needs someone stronger on the file." Someone stronger was a soft way to say someone with cleaner credit, steadier income, and less debt. The fact that she said it like a practical detail instead of a request made my stomach tighten before I even read the first page. I pulled the document closer and saw my name already printed on it. Not handwritten in the margin, not penciled as a possibility, not mentioned in a note for later. Printed. Full legal name, address, employer, income bracket, and enough personal information filled out that my first thought was not even about the loan, but about how many conversations had already happened before I got there. I turned the next page and found sticky tabs marking the signature lines, and the tabs were not general reminders for a bank officer or for my sister. They were mine. My name was beside them. My signature was the missing piece. I looked up and asked, "You filled this out with my information?" My sister shifted in her chair and said, "Mom had most of it already." That line hit harder than any shouting could have, because it told me this had not been a rushed idea or a desperate question raised 5 minutes before I arrived. They had gathered what they needed, sorted out what they knew, guessed the rest, and decided it was acceptable to place me in the center of a financial document before I had even heard the proposal. I looked at my mother. "You gave them my information?" "It's basic information," she said quickly, which was always how she defended crossing a line. "Nothing sensitive. My address, employer, date of birth, and income range had apparently stopped being sensitive once they became useful to someone else." I noticed then that the income range was not even accurate. It was higher than what I made, not wildly higher, but high enough that someone had rounded me into a better version of myself for the bank. "Where did this income number come from?" I asked. My mother glanced at my sister before answering, and that tiny glance told me there was more behind the paperwork than anyone wanted to explain. "It was an estimate," she said. "You mentioned something close to that last year." "I mentioned a possible raise last year," I said. "I didn't get it." My brother-in-law finally looked up from the table. "That can be corrected later," he said, speaking quickly, like the mistake was an inconvenience rather than proof that they had been building a version of my life without me in the room. I flipped another page and found the words I already knew were coming: cosigner, liability, borrower responsibility, and responsibility for payment if the primary borrowers failed to meet their obligations. The document did not say moral support, family favor, temporary help, or harmless paperwork. It said that if my sister and her husband could not pay, I could become the person the bank looked at next. I put the page down carefully because I did not want the tremor in my hand to become the thing they focused on, and I asked the first practical question that came to mind. "How far behind are you?" The room changed immediately, and for the first time that night nobody had a prepared answer. My sister looked at her husband, my mother looked at my sister, and my dad stared at the table like the grain in the wood had suddenly become important. Eventually, my brother-in-law cleared his throat and said, 2 payments, technically. The rate adjusted, insurance went up, and the payment is almost 30% higher than it was last year." Technically was doing a lot of work in that sentence, but it was still the first honest thing anyone had said since I arrived. "So the bank won't approve this without someone else on the file?" I said. No one corrected me. That silence was better than a confession. My mother reached for the folder as if she could guide the conversation back to the version she preferred. "It's just to qualify. Your name strengthens the application, and once everything stabilizes, it won't be an issue. If I'm on this," I said, keeping my voice lower than I felt, "then I'm responsible for it." "That is literally what these pages say." "You're overthinking it," she said. "No," I answered, still looking at the document. "I'm reading it." That was the first moment the polite performance cracked. Nobody yelled, but the air got tighter, and the room lost that fake dinner rhythm everyone had been working so hard to maintain. My sister leaned forward, finally looking directly at me. "We wouldn't ask if we had another option." The word ask landed wrong because nothing about the setup felt like asking. Asking would have meant calling me before forms were filled out. Asking would have meant explaining the situation privately and giving me time to check what I was being pulled into. Asking would have meant accepting that no was a possible answer. "You didn't ask," I said. "You filled this out, invited me to dinner, and waited until everyone was sitting here." Her husband exhaled through his nose, annoyed now. It's not like that. We talked it through with your parents, and everyone agreed this made sense. Everyone. I nodded once, because that single word told me exactly where I stood in the process. Everyone except the person whose name is on the paperwork. My dad leaned forward, elbows near his plate, and used the calm voice he always used when he wanted to sound reasonable while shutting something down. Don't turn this into something it's not. Your sister is trying to keep her house, and this is what family does when someone is in trouble. There it was, the family argument, polished and ready. I looked at him and asked, family puts someone on a loan without telling him first? He did not answer that question, because the honest answer would have ruined his position. Instead, he looked irritated, like I had chosen the wrong moral detail to care about. My mother flipped forward and pointed at a section of the agreement. Look, this just strengthens the application. Your name helps them get approved, but you are not going to be paying the mortgage. I tapped the same paragraph she was pointing at. It says I am responsible if they do not pay. That is standard wording, she said, with the confidence of someone who had decided legal language became meaningless if it was inconvenient. I turned to my sister. How long have you known you needed a co-signer? She hesitated long enough to answer without answering. A couple weeks. A couple weeks meant they had time to call me, time to explain, time to ask, time to give me the paperwork before dinner, and time to let me say no without an audience. Instead, they chose a table, a pen, and a room full of people waiting for me to be difficult or obedient. I kept reading, partly because I wanted to understand the whole trap before stepping out of it, and partly because I could feel them getting uncomfortable every time I found another detail. On one page, my current rent was listed as lower than it actually was. On another, my estimated savings were described in a way that made me look more secure than I felt. It was not enough to be cartoonishly fraudulent, but it was enough to make me realize they had massaged everything in one direction. Who filled out the part about my rent? I asked. My sister looked at my mother again. My mother sighed, as if I was making the evening tedious by noticing things. I knew roughly what you pay. If it needs correcting, correct it. That's not the point, I said. Then what is the point? My dad asked, the patience finally thinning from his voice. The point is that all of you were comfortable submitting a version of my life to a bank before asking whether I wanted to be involved. That sentence sat there for a moment, and nobody rushed to pick it up. My sister's eyes started to shine, but not in a way that made me think she was suddenly understanding me. It looked more like panic mixed with anger, the look people get when they realize the guilt they plan to use might not be enough. We are trying not to lose our house, she said. That is the point. Then say that, I answered. Say you're in serious trouble and you need help, but don't sit here pretending this is a harmless signature. My brother-in-law rubbed his forehead. Fine. Yes, we're in trouble, but we're not deadbeats. We had a bad year. I changed jobs, the payment jumped, and we got behind. We are trying to fix it before it becomes worse. That was the first time he had said it plainly, and for half a second, I actually felt the old instinct to help. Not sign, not take legal responsibility, but help in some other way. Maybe look over numbers, maybe help them think through selling, maybe lend a small amount if there was a plan, but the possibility vanished as soon as my mother reached for the pen. Then we agree it is serious, she said, sliding it closer to me. So let's stop turning this into an interrogation and deal with the problem. That movement, small as it was, killed whatever sympathy had started to appear. She had heard the same explanation I had heard, but instead of treating it like a reason to slow down, she treated it like a reason to corner me faster. I closed the folder slowly. I'm not signing this. My mother blinked as if the words had arrived in a language she did not expect. What do you mean? I mean, I'm not putting my name on this. My sister leaned forward quickly. Can you at least think about it? I already did, I said. I thought about it the moment I saw my name printed on a document I had never agreed to. Her husband's irritation finally pushed through his polite mask. Come on, man, it's not like we're asking you to give us money. You're asking me to take the risk instead, I said. That landed harder than he expected, and for a second, he had nothing. My dad tried another angle. You're being rigid. Helping is when you ask first, I said. Not when you decide someone's role and then bring him in at the end. My mother's voice sharpened, even though she was still trying to sound calm. You have a stable job, you rent, and you're not buying anything right now. This will not affect you the way you think it will. That was the moment I realized they had discussed not only my information, but my life. They had weighed my job, my rent, my plans, and whatever they thought I did not need yet, then used those details to justify taking space in my financial future. It affects my credit, I said. It affects my debt-to-income ratio. It affects anything I might want to do later. You don't get to decide those things matter less because you need me tonight. My sister's face tightened. So the house is just supposed to be gone because you want to make a point? That was the pivot, and I heard it the second it happened. The document stopped being the issue, and I became the issue instead. I'm not making a point, I said. I'm refusing to sign a loan. It's a refinance, she snapped. It is still debt with my name attached to it. My mom slid the pen closer to me, not dramatically, just enough for everyone to see it move. Let's not turn this into a fight. Read it properly, sign where it is marked, and we can talk about any concerns after. I looked at the pen, then at her, because that sentence gave away more than she meant it to. After I signed, she paused. That pause told me the order of events had always been the point. You already told the bank I was doing this, didn't you? I asked. No one answered. My father looked away first. That was enough. I pushed the folder back toward the center of the table, stood up, and said, I'm not signing. There was no shouting from me, no slammed chair, and no dramatic speech about betrayal, because by that point the cleanest thing I could do was leave before they turned the table into a courtroom. My mother half stood. So you're just leaving? You already made the decision without me, I said. I'm just giving you my answer. Behind me, as I reached the hallway, I heard my sister say something under her breath and my dad answer in the flat, disappointed voice he used when he wanted silence to feel like punishment. My mother told someone to stop, probably because she still cared about how the argument sounded from the outside, and I put my coat back on without turning around. The drive home felt longer than the drive there. I kept replaying small details that had seemed strange when I arrived and obvious once I left. The pen on top of the folder, my mother blocking questions in the hallway, my father waiting for his cue, my sister letting my mother do most of the talking until it was time to make me feel guilty. I also kept thinking about one thing I wished I had asked before walking out. If my information was already on those documents, and if the bank had already been told I was going to be involved, what exactly had they said about me before I got there? The messages started the next afternoon. My mother sent the first one. Can we talk? There was no apology attached to it, no acknowledgement that my name had been used before I agreed to anything, and no hint that the conversation she wanted would be about what they had done. It felt like an invitation to resume the pressure somewhere quieter. I left it unanswered. A few hours later, she sent another message. You left things in a bad place. That almost got me, because for a second I wanted to write back that I had not put things anywhere, that I had walked into a bad place already prepared for me. But I knew exactly what would happen if I opened that door. We would stop talking about the document and start talking about my tone, my timing, my loyalty, and whether I had embarrassed them at dinner. So I did not reply. The next day, my sister called twice and then sent, Are you seriously ignoring me over this? Over this. That phrase told me she had already shrunk the entire situation down into something small enough to blame me for. Not a legal document, not a risk to my credit, not a family decision made without the person affected, just this. By the third day, my dad joined in with, This is getting childish. I read that one twice, not because it hurt, but because it confirmed that none of them were working their way toward the actual problem. They were circling the same conclusion from different angles. I had failed the family by refusing the role they had assigned me. Over the next 2 weeks, the messages came less often, but they became more specific. My mother told me my sister was barely sleeping. My dad said stress makes people say things badly, which was apparently the closest anyone was going to get to admitting the dinner was wrong. My sister sent a long text about how humiliating it was to ask for help, even though the whole problem was that she had not really asked at all. I did not block them right away. I kept telling myself that if one of them said the right sentence, even once, I might answer. The sentence was simple. We should have asked you first. Nobody sent it. About 3 weeks after the dinner, my mother messaged me late at night and said, If this doesn't go through, they might lose the house. That one sat with me longer than I wanted to admit. I opened the thread twice and started typing once, because I am not made of stone and I did not enjoy the idea of my sister losing her home. The problem was that the emotional weight of the situation did not erase the way they had handled it. And if I replied while feeling guilty, they would not hear concern, they would smell movement. I deleted the half-written message and put my phone face down. There was also one message from my mother that I never answered but never forgot. She wrote, "You have no idea what your refusal is doing to this family." And the wording bothered me because it made my refusal sound like the act of damage instead of the boundary around damage that already existed. I sat with that for an entire evening, not because I agreed with her, but because family guilt has a way of making even clear facts feel negotiable after dark. The next morning, with a clearer head, I wrote the sentence down in a note on my phone, and underneath it I wrote what was actually true. I did not miss their payments. I did not choose their mortgage. I did not inflate my income on a form, and I did not put my name on paper before asking myself for permission. Seeing those facts in plain words did not make the situation painless, but it made it harder for them to rearrange it in my head. A few days later, my dad called from a number I did not recognize, which was a trick I only understood after I answered. He did not yell at first. He asked how work was, told me the weather had been miserable, and then slid into the real reason for the call so smoothly that it almost sounded accidental. "Your mother is taking this very hard," he said. I sat at my kitchen table with the phone against my ear and watched a glass of water leave a ring on the wood. "I'm sure everyone is stressed." "That is not what I mean," he said. "You are punishing the whole family over one uncomfortable dinner." There it was again, the reduction. One uncomfortable dinner. Not the paperwork, not the false assumptions, not the fact that my future had been treated like spare capacity in someone else's emergency. "I'm not punishing anyone," I said. "I said no to a loan. You know it isn't just a loan to them. It is to the bank." He went quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again his voice was colder. "You always do this. You turn everything into technicalities so you don't have to feel responsible." That would have worked on me 5 years earlier. It probably had worked on me 5 years earlier, in smaller ways, when I paid for dinners I did not choose or covered repairs that were called temporary and never mentioned again. This time, though, the technicality was the entire point. Contracts do not care that someone cried at a dinner table. "I'm going to hang up if this is just another version of the same conversation," I said. "Then hang up," he answered. "But don't act surprised when people remember who showed up for family and who didn't." I ended the call without saying anything else, and my hand was shaking more after that conversation than it had at dinner. Not because I regretted my answer, but because guilt works best when it uses voices you grew up trusting. That night, I pulled my credit report for the first time in months, partly out of paranoia and partly because I needed something factual in front of me. There was no new loan, no hard inquiry I could see, and nothing that suggested they had actually submitted the final paperwork with my consent. Still, seeing my own financial life laid out in numbers made me angrier, because it reminded me how easily a signature could have turned their crisis into mine. A few days after that, my brother-in-law sent me a message directly for the first time since the dinner. It was not long, and somehow that made it worse. He wrote that he knew things had been handled badly, but that pride was ruining a practical solution, and that if the house went into foreclosure, my sister would never forgive me for letting it happen when I had the ability to stop it. I read that message during lunch at work, sitting in my car with a sandwich I suddenly did not want, and I remember thinking how carefully he had placed the blame. The late payments were not the cause anymore. The loan they had taken for renovations was not the cause. The choice to prepare documents behind my back was not the cause. Somehow, after all of that, the disaster would become my fault at the exact moment I refused to rescue them from it. I typed 3 different replies and deleted all of them. The first one was angry, the second one was too defensive, and the third one sounded like I was begging him to understand something he had already decided not to understand. In the end, I wrote, "Do not make me responsible for decisions I did not make." And even that felt like more explanation than he deserved. He did not respond for 2 days. When he finally did, he wrote, "Must be nice to have the luxury of principles." That line almost pulled me back into the argument, because it was exactly the kind of sentence that makes you want to prove you are not cold. Then I realized that was the hook. If I defended my principles, they would call me selfish. If I defended my finances, they would call me cold. If I defended my boundaries, they would say I cared more about being right than helping family. Every path led back to the same table, the same pen, and the same expectation that I would eventually get tired of being the bad guy. So I stopped answering him too. The strange thing was that the more I stayed quiet, the more I noticed how much of the pressure depended on me participating. They needed me to argue so they could turn the argument into proof that I was unreasonable. They needed me to explain so they could pick apart the explanation. They needed me to sound guilty so they could push harder where the guilt showed. Silence was not noble or dramatic. It was just the first response I had found that did not give them something to reshape. The silence after that stretched for a while. I went to work, paid my own bills, and got used to not checking my phone every time it buzzed. The distance did not feel good at first, but it did feel cleaner, like stepping out of a room where everyone had been breathing the same stale air for too long. Then my sister tried a different approach. She emailed me a spreadsheet. No greeting beyond my name. No apology. Just a file called Refine Numbers and a message saying, maybe if you actually see it broken down, you'll understand we aren't trying to screw you. I almost deleted it without opening it, but curiosity won. The spreadsheet had monthly payment estimates, projected savings, a line for catching up the missed payments, and a column labeled Family Support, which was bolded like that made it more legitimate. My name was not written in that column, but it might as well have been, because the numbers only worked if someone else absorbed the risk that the bank did not want to take. There was one detail buried near the bottom that explained more than any of their messages had. They had also taken out a personal loan the previous year to cover renovations that were supposed to raise the value of the house, except the renovations had gone over budget and the contractor had left part of the work unfinished. Nobody mentioned that at dinner. I stared at that line for a long time, because it changed the story from unlucky payment increase to a pattern of decisions I had been carefully not told about. They did not just need help because the market was cruel or because one bill went up. They needed help because they had stacked problems on top of each other until a bank looked at the pile and asked for a cleaner person to stand next to it. I wrote back one sentence. Do not send me more documents about this. My sister responded 20 minutes later. I knew you wouldn't even try to understand. I did not answer that either, but it bothered me more than I wanted it to. Not because she was right, but because the whole family had become very good at presenting my refusal to be used as a refusal to understand. 2 months after the dinner, my sister showed up at my door without calling first. When I opened it, she looked tired in a way that made me think the situation had moved from stressful to real. Her hair was pulled back, she had no makeup on, and she held her phone in one hand like she had been checking messages all the way up the stairs. Can we talk? She asked. It was the same opening my mother had used, and I almost laughed at how little the script had changed, but I stepped outside and closed the door behind me because I did not want her inside if the conversation went where I thought it would. What's going on? I asked. She stared at the hallway floor for a moment. They didn't approve it. I nodded, because there was nothing surprising about that anymore. They said if we had a stronger co-signer, it could change things, she added, and the sentence came out softer than it had at dinner, but it was still the same sentence wearing different clothes. I let a few seconds pass before answering. So you came here to ask me again. I came here because I don't know what else to do, she said, and for the first time she sounded less defensive and more exhausted. We're not trying to dump everything on you. We just need support on the file long enough to get through this. That was the kind of line that might have worked if the first conversation had been honest. It might have led to questions, maybe even advice, maybe a discussion about selling before things got worse. But after the dinner, it only sounded like the same pressure in a quieter voice. You already know my answer, I said. Her face tightened. So that's it. You're just going to let this happen? I'm not causing this, I said. I'm not part of the mortgage. I'm not part of the late payments. And I'm not becoming part of it now because everyone waited until the damage was already done. She looked at me for a long moment, and I could see she wanted to call me selfish because that would make the conversation easier for her. Instead, she swallowed and said, I didn't think you'd be like this. I nodded once. I know. There was nothing satisfying about that moment. No victory music, no perfect comeback, no sudden realization where she admitted I was right. She just stood there for a few seconds, hurt and angry, and then she left the same way she came, carrying a problem I refused to let become mine. A week later, my mother sent a final long message that read more like a closing argument than a conversation. She said family should sacrifice, that my sister had made mistakes but did not deserve to be abandoned, that my father was disappointed, and that one day I would understand what it meant to need people. She said I had always been too independent, as if independence was a character flaw that only became visible when I refused to sign a bank document. I read it once, then read it again, and the part that stayed with me was not the disappointment or the guilt. It was the fact that, even in a message long enough to fill my whole screen, she never said she was sorry for giving out my information or putting my name on paperwork before I agreed. That was the moment I stopped waiting for the right sentence. When I went back inside after my sister's visit, I sat down and realized that for the first time since that dinner, I did not feel like something was waiting outside my door. The pressure had come back. I had answered it clearly, and it had left. They still send messages sometimes, mostly on birthdays and holidays, written politely enough that an outsider would think I was cruel for not responding. Hope you're well. We should talk soon. Family shouldn't stay like this. They never mentioned the folder, the pen, the bank, or the fact that my name was on a document before I knew the document existed. I do not reply, not because I am angry every day, and not because I enjoy the silence, but because I already said the only answer that mattered when I left that pen untouched on the table.